Ezekiel's hands would not stop trembling. He stood in the wine cellar beneath Thornley Manor, 3 hours before the wedding feast would begin, and watched his fingers shake as they wrapped around the neck of a French bottle that had traveled across an ocean to rest in this Virginia darkness. The bottle was cool against his palm, slick with the condensation of the underground air, and he could feel the lead seal beneath his thumb, that soft, poisonous metal that the French vintners had pressed into the cork decades ago, never knowing it would become something more than a seal. Never knowing it would become a weapon. The wine inside had aged in darkness, as he had aged in darkness. 43 years of his life were spent in the shadows of white men's houses, moving through their world like a ghost they acknowledged only when they needed something. 43 years of, yes, master, and, right away, master, and eyes cast down to floorboards he had scrubbed until his knuckles bled. But the wine had absorbed the lead, leached it from the seal drop by poisonous drop, until the ruby liquid had become something beautiful and deadly, just as he had become something more than the thing they called property. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracing the line of his jaw before disappearing into the collar of the crisp white shirt they made him wear for serving. Above his head, the floorboards creaked with footsteps and laughter. He could hear them, the Thornley family preparing for Dorothea's wedding to Montgomery Ashford, that pale boy from the Charleston Cotton Empire who looked at enslaved women the way men looked at horses they were considering purchasing. The laughter filtered down through the ceiling like water through cracks, and Ezekiel felt his jaw clench so tightly that his teeth ached. He poured the wine into the crystal decanter with the steady hand of long practice, though inside him something was screaming. The liquid caught the candlelight as it fell, glinting like rubies, like blood, like the earrings Dorothea would wear tonight, the ones purchased with the money from selling Prudence South. His daughter. His baby girl who had just turned 12 when they dragged her to the auction block in Richmond, her screams echoing off the brick buildings while Augustus Thornley counted his money and discussed the quality of the wedding silverware with Abigail. Prudence's screams still lived in his skull. They had taken up residence there 6 months ago and never left, playing on an endless loop every time he closed his eyes. Papa. Papa, don't let them. Please, Papa. But he had stood there with his head bowed and his hands clenched behind his back, because to fight would mean death, and Delilah had begged him with her eyes to stay alive, to survive, because surely they could buy Prudence back someday, surely there was still hope. But there was no hope. There had never been hope. And Delilah was gone now too. The wine continued to pour, steady and sure, filling the decanter until it caught the light like liquid fire. Ezekiel set the empty bottle aside and reached for another, his movements mechanical, automatic, the muscle memory of decades. He had been the Thornley house servant since he was 7 years old, trained to move through their world without disturbing it, to anticipate their needs before they voiced them, to be invisible until he was required to be visible. He knew which wines Augustus preferred with red meat, which Abigail favored with fish, which bottles Cornelius Jr. would drain fast as trying to impress the Charleston belles who would flutter and giggle at his crude jokes. He knew exactly how to kill them all. The cellar door opened above, spilling afternoon sunlight down the stone steps, and Ezekiel's heart seized for a moment before he forced his face into the mask, the expression of pleasant emptiness that had kept him alive this long. Temperance descended, her arms full of linens, her face tight with exhaustion. She was 25, born in this house as he had been, and she had lost 3 children to the auction block. They never spoke of it. There were things too terrible for words, sorrows that lived in the spaces between breaths. They want the French wine, she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. The Chateau Margaux for the toast. Miss Abigail says it must be perfect. It will be, Ezekiel replied, his voice flat and deferential. I have it ready. Temperance paused on the stairs, her back to him, and for a moment he thought she might say something more. But she only nodded once and continued up into the light, and Ezekiel was alone again with the bottles and the darkness and the screaming inside his head that never stopped. He remembered the day Delilah died. It had been 3 months ago, in the August heat that turned the Virginia air into something you could chew. She had been ill for a week, a fever, chills, a cough that rattled in her chest like dried beans in a jar. She had asked the overseer, Silas Crow, for permission to rest, to see a doctor, to have even one day away from the cotton fields that stretched out behind the manor like an ocean of white. Crow had laughed. That sound still haunted Ezekiel too, that wet, phlegmy laughter that said a slave's suffering was entertainment. When Delilah collapsed in the field, too weak to continue, Crow had her whipped. 20 lashes for laziness, he said. For shirking. For costing Master Thornley money with her weakness. Ezekiel had been in the house when it happened, polishing silver for the dinner party Abigail was hosting, and he heard Delilah's screams across the distance. He had dropped the fork he was holding, dropped it right on the dining room floor, and Abigail had slapped him for his clumsiness, for disturbing the peace of her afternoon, for existing in her presence with distress on his face. By the time he was allowed to go to Delilah that night, infection had already set into the wounds. She died in his arms 3 days later, whispering Prudence's name, asking where their daughter was, if she was safe, if she would ever come home. And Ezekiel had lied to his dying wife, had told her yes, Prudence would come home, because the truth, that she was gone forever, that they would never see her again, that their family had been torn apart to pay for crystal glasses and silver forks and a wedding dress imported from Paris, was too cruel even for a deathbed. The wine glistened in the decanters arranged on the serving table. Ezekiel had selected them all carefully over the past week, using the keys he had copied years ago when Augustus was too drunk to notice them missing for a few hours. The oldest bottles, the ones with the lead seals that had been slowly poisoning the contents for decades. The bottles no one ever inventoried because Augustus couldn't remember what he had in his cellar, only that he had more than his neighbors, more than his brother in Richmond, more than anyone else in the county. Ezekiel lifted one decanter to the light, watching the ruby liquid catch and refract the candle flame. Beautiful. Deadly. Justice in crystal. Above his head, the manor exploded into activity. He could hear the carriages arriving on the circular drive, the crunch of wheels on gravel, the whine of horses, the excited chatter of guests who had traveled from Charleston and Richmond and Savannah to witness this union of two great families. The musicians were warming up in the ballroom, violin strings singing through the floorboards. In the kitchen, he knew, the enslaved cooks would be working over fires hot as hell itself, preparing 20 courses for 200 guests who would eat and drink and dance while the people who served them went hungry. Footsteps thundered overhead, and Ezekiel recognized the heavy tread of Augustus Thornley himself. His master's voice boomed through the house, jovial and loud, welcoming guests with the false heartiness of a man who measured his worth in acres and human flesh. Ezekiel had served Augustus Thornley for 36 years. He had watched him grow from a cruel boy into a crueler man. He had dressed him, shaved him, held his head while he vomited from too much whiskey, listened to him boast about his wealth and his power and his God-given right to own other human beings. Tonight, he would poison him. The thought should have terrified him, should have made his hands shake even more, should have filled him with the kind of paralyzing fear that had kept him docile all these years. But instead, Ezekiel felt only a cold, terrible calm settling over him like a shroud. This was righteous. This was justice. This was the only power a powerless man could wield when the law protected his oppressors and called his suffering property rights. He arranged the decanters on the silver serving tray with the precision of an artist. The Chateau Margaux for the toast. Bordeaux for the first course. The Burgundy for the lamb. The Sauternes for dessert. Each one tainted, corrupted, transformed from luxury into vengeance. He wondered if they would taste it, that slight bitterness beneath the aged complexity, that metallic edge that lead left on the tongue. He thought they probably wouldn't. Rich people rarely paid attention to what they consumed, secure in the knowledge that everything was meant for their pleasure. A child's cry pierced the air above, sharp and sudden, followed by the sound of a slap and Cornelius Jr.'s voice shouting about clumsiness. Ezekiel's hands tightened on the tray. He knew that sound, had heard it echo through this house his entire life. The casual cruelty of people who saw other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. Young Cornelius had his father's sadism but none of his cunning. At 19, he was already known for his treatment of the enslaved women, for the children he fathered and never acknowledged, for the violence he inflicted for sport. Tonight, Cornelius Jr. would drink deeply. Ezekiel would make certain of that. He began the ascent from the cellar, the tray balanced perfectly in his hands despite the trembling that wanted to return. Each step took him closer to the surface, closer to the light and the laughter and the music. Closer to the moment when everything would change. His face was composed, empty, the mask firmly in place. Inside, Prudence was still screaming. Inside, Delilah was still dying in his arms. Inside, 43 years of rage had crystallized into something diamond-hard and unbreakable. The ballroom awaited, glittering with chandeliers and decorated with flowers that cost more than a human life. The guests awaited, dressed in silks and satins bought with blood. The Thornley family awaited, fat and happy and secure in their power. And Ezekiel, invisible as always, would serve them wine. If you're already gripped by this tale of revenge and horror, subscribe now so you never miss another macabre story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think will happen next. The chapel at Thornley Manor had been built by Augustus's grandfather in 1789, a testament to the family's supposed piety, constructed with hands that would never be free to worship in it. Ezekiel stood in the shadowed alcove behind the last pew, holding a silver tray of water glasses should any guest require refreshment during the ceremony, and watched Dorothea Thornley become Dorothea Ashford in a ritual that proclaimed God's blessing upon a union purchased with his daughter's freedom. Dorothea was 17, her skin pale as the imported lace that cascaded from her veil in waves of delicate patternwork shipped from Brussels. The dress alone had cost $800, Ezekiel knew because he had heard Abigail boasting about it to her sister from Savannah. $800. The same price they had gotten for Prudence at the Richmond auction, though Prudence had been young and strong and would give her new owner decades of labor, while the dress would be worn once and then stored in a trunk to yellow with age. Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood stood before the altar in his finest vestments, his voice rolling through the chapel with practiced authority as he spoke of Christian duty and divine order. He was a large man, fond of his supper and fonder still of his position in society, and he had never once preached against the institution that filled his collection plate. His words washed over the assembled guests like warm honey, the sanctity of marriage, the natural hierarchy ordained by God, the blessedness of this union between two great families. Behind him, the stained glass window depicted Christ among the children, and the irony of it made Ezekiel's throat tight with suppressed laughter that would have sounded like screaming. Montgomery Ashford stood beside his bride, 22 years old and handsome in the way of men who had never known hardship. His family owned 6 plantations across South Carolina, their wealth built on rice and cotton and the bodies of 2,000 enslaved people who would never speak their names aloud in his presence. He smiled at Dorothea with what might have been genuine affection, and Ezekiel wondered if Montgomery loved her, if he was capable of love when he had been raised to see humanity as divisible into those who commanded and those who obeyed. The wedding party flanked the couple, bridesmaids in pale pink silk, groomsmen in black tailcoats. Cornelius Jr. stood as best man, his cravat slightly askew, already bored with the proceedings and eyeing a Charleston belle named Lavinia Sutherland who kept glancing at him through her lashes. The bridesmaids included Dorothea's cousin Beatrice Harrington from Louisiana and Montgomery's sister Felicity, both simpering and dabbing at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs as though the scene were genuinely moving rather than merely expensive. Along the walls, standing at precise intervals like furniture, were the enslaved attendants. Obadiah held a fan to keep the air circulating in the warm chapel. Young Mercy, only 10 years old, stood ready with smelling salts should any lady swoon from the heat or the emotion. Temperance waited near the door to usher guests to the reception. They were all dressed in matching livery, clean, pressed, inhuman in their uniformity. Their faces were carefully blank, and Ezekiel knew the effort that blankness required, the way you had to hollow yourself out and become an empty vessel so that nothing showed, nothing betrayed the screaming inside. Do you, Montgomery Thaddeus Ashford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Reverend Blackwood intoned, and Montgomery's, I do, rang out clear and confident, the voice of a man who had never doubted his right to claim what he wanted. Ezekiel's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the silver tray. In less than an hour, he would begin serving the wine. In less than an hour, the poison would start its slow, irreversible work. The thought should have made his heart race, but instead he felt only that cold calm, that diamond-hard certainty that had settled over him in the cellar. The ceremony concluded with Reverend Blackwood pronouncing them man and wife, and the guests erupted in polite applause as Montgomery kissed his bride. The chapel bells began to ring, brass bells cast in England, their sound carrying across the plantation grounds where 300 enslaved people would hear them and know that their suffering had funded another generation of Thornley prosperity. The wedding party processed down the aisle in a rustle of silk and self-satisfaction, and Ezekiel bowed his head as they passed, invisible as always, his presence acknowledged only by Abigail's sharp glance to ensure he was ready to serve at the reception. The ballroom at Thornley Manor was a cathedral of wealth. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, each holding 200 candles that cast dancing light across walls papered in French silk. The floor was polished marble imported from Italy, so smooth that the ladies' reflection glided beneath them as they walked. Long tables groaned under the weight of the wedding feast, 20 courses prepared over 3 days by enslaved cooks who had worked in shifts around the clock, their hands burned and blistered, their feet swollen from standing. Ezekiel took his position near the wine service, his face composed, his white gloves spotless. The decanters were arranged before him like jewels, ruby red, deep amber, pale gold. Beautiful. Deadly. Perfect. The guests flooded in from the chapel, a river of silk and superficiality. Augustus Thornley held court near the head table, his chest puffed with pride, accepting congratulations from his peers with the magnanimity of a man who considered himself blessed by providence rather than enriched by atrocity. He was 58, his face ruddy from good living and better whiskey, his waistcoat straining across a belly that had never known hunger. Beside him, Abigail preened in emerald silk, her neck dripping with diamonds, her mouth curved in a smile that never reached her calculating eyes. "Augustus, you've outdone yourself," boomed Theodore Beaumont, a plantation owner from Savannah whose hands were stained with tobacco and cruelty. "This is a wedding that will be remembered for years." "Nothing but the best for my daughter," Augustus replied, clapping Beaumont on the shoulder. "And speaking of the best, you must try the Chateau Margaux I've been saving. Ezekiel. Bring the French wine for the toast." Ezekiel moved forward with the practiced grace of decades, the decanter steady in his hands. He poured for Augustus first, then for the guests at the head table, Abigail, Cornelius Jr., the bride and groom, Montgomery's parents Reginald and Constance Ashford. The wine splashed into crystal glasses, catching the candlelight, and no one noticed the slight tremor in the servant's hands, the bead of sweat at his temple, the way his eyes lingered for just a moment too long on each face. These people would be dead by midnight. "A toast!" Augustus called out, raising his glass high. The ballroom fell silent, 200 guests lifting their glasses in anticipation. "To my daughter Dorothea and her husband Montgomery. May their union be blessed with prosperity, health, and many children to carry on our family's legacy. To the bride and groom." "To the bride and groom," the guests echoed, and the sound of crystal chiming against crystal filled the air like bells. They drank deeply, savoring the aged complexity of wine that had crossed an ocean to poison them. Ezekiel moved through the crowd with mechanical efficiency, refilling glasses, pouring new ones, ensuring that the poisoned wine flowed freely to every table. The Harringtons from New Orleans, Jeremiah and his wife Constance, drained their glasses quickly, already flushed with heat and excitement. The Wainwrights from Baltimore, textile merchants who bought cotton soaked in enslaved people's sweat, discussed business between sips. Senator Horatio Pemberton from Richmond held forth on the sanctity of states' rights while his wife Prudence, the name like a knife in Ezekiel's chest, nodded along adoringly. Young Lavinia Sutherland giggled as Cornelius Jr. whispered something in her ear, something that made her blush and reach for her wine glass to hide her smile. She couldn't have been more than 16, dressed in white muslin that proclaimed her purity, and Ezekiel wondered if she knew what kind of man Cornelius really was, if anyone had told her about the enslaved women he had forced himself upon, about the children he had fathered and then sold. Near the windows, Montgomery's younger brother Nathaniel stood with a group of young men from Charleston, all of them discussing the merits of various breeding stock as though they were talking about horses rather than human beings. Their laughter carried across the ballroom, casual and cruel, and Ezekiel felt his jaw tighten as he refilled their glasses. The first course arrived, oysters on the half-shell, gleaming wetly on beds of crushed ice. The guests fell upon them with enthusiasm, slurping and exclaiming over the freshness, the quality, the expense. Between courses, they drank. They always drank. Wine with oysters, wine with soup, wine with fish, wine with fowl, wine with red meat, wine with dessert, wine because the glasses were never empty and the servants were always there to fill them. Silas Crow, the overseer, stood near the veranda doors, out of place among the finery but invited because Augustus believed in rewarding loyalty. He was a thick-shouldered man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no light. Those were the hands that had whipped Delilah to death. Those were the hands that had scarred the backs of countless enslaved people for infractions real and imagined. He held his wine glass awkwardly, more accustomed to whiskey, but he drank it anyway because it was free and it was there. Ezekiel watched him drink. Watched the wine disappear down his throat. Watched him reach for a refill. Temperance passed nearby carrying a tray of canapés, and their eyes met for the briefest moment. Something flickered in her expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. She knew him too well not to sense that something had shifted, that the Ezekiel serving wine tonight was not quite the same man who had served breakfast this morning. But she said nothing, only moved on with her tray, her face carefully blank. The wedding feast continued, course after course of obscene abundance. Terrapin soup steaming in porcelain bowls. Roasted duck with cherry sauce arranged artfully on silver platters. Beef Wellington bleeding pink at the center. Aspic salads trembling and translucent. The guests ate and drank and laughed, their faces flushed with wine and satisfaction, their conversations flowing from business to gossip to politics and back again. And through it all, Ezekiel poured. His hands steady now, his face an empty mask, his mind calculating every glass, every bottle, every drop of poison finding its way into the bodies of his oppressors. The lead was already in their systems, already beginning its slow, inexorable work. They couldn't taste it beneath the aged complexity of the wine. They couldn't feel it yet, though soon they would. Augustus Thornley raised his glass again, calling for silence. Another toast, he bellowed, his voice slightly slurred. To prosperity. To my family. To the continuation of our way of life. Here, here, the guests roared back, and they drank deeply once more. Ezekiel stood in the shadows and watched them seal their fate. The feast stretched into its third hour, and between courses Ezekiel's mind drifted backward through time like smoke curling through the gaps in a door. He stood near the wine service, refilling crystal decanters, his movements automatic while memory pulled him down into darker places. The ballroom around him blurred, the chandeliers becoming distant stars, the laughter becoming white noise, and he was somewhere else, someone else, though the pain remained constant across all versions of himself. 6 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in April, they had come for Prudence. Ezekiel remembered the exact quality of light that day, the way the Virginia sun had slanted through the windows of the small cabin he shared with his family, turning the dust motes into floating specks of gold. Delilah had been making breakfast, cornmeal mush, the same thing they ate every morning, and Prudence had been humming some tune she'd learned from the kitchen girls, her voice sweet and clear in the morning air. She was 12 years old, still young enough to sometimes forget the weight of the chains they couldn't see, old enough to understand what it meant when Augustus Thornley walked through their door with a buyer from Mississippi at his side. This one, Augustus had said, pointing at Prudence the way he might point at a piece of furniture he was considering selling. Strong. Healthy. Good teeth. She'll give you 20 years of solid work, maybe more. The Mississippi man had walked around Prudence in a slow circle, examining her like livestock. He'd opened her mouth to check her teeth, felt the muscles in her arms, nodded with satisfaction. She'll do it. What's your price? 800. I'll give you 750. Done. That was it. That was all it took to destroy a family. A brief negotiation, a handshake, money changing hands. Prudence had looked at her father with eyes that held the whole world's terror, and Ezekiel had stood there with his head bowed and his fists clenched behind his back, knowing that to fight was to die, that to resist meant they would all be sold, that his only choice was to watch his daughter be taken from him forever. When they dragged her away, and they had to drag her, because she'd fought with everything she had, screaming for her papa, for her mama, her small fists beating against the buyer's chest, Delilah had collapsed on the floor of their cabin and wept until no sound came out anymore. Just silent, shaking sobs that went on for hours. And Ezekiel had held her and promised they would save money somehow, buy Prudence back somehow, though both of them knew it was a lie. Enslaved people had no money. Enslaved people had nothing but the grief their masters allowed them to keep. In the present, Cornelius Jr. demanded another glass of wine, snapping his fingers at Ezekiel with the casual contempt of someone who had never seen him as human. You there? More of the Bordeaux. Quickly now. Yes, sir, Ezekiel murmured, moving forward with the decanter. The poisoned wine splashed into the young man's glass, and Cornelius drained half of it in one swallow, trying to impress Lavinia Sutherland, who watched him with the admiration of a girl who didn't yet know what monsters looked like. Ezekiel's hands had stopped trembling entirely now. The cold certainty had spread through his entire body like ice forming on a winter pond, solid, unbreakable, clear. He poured wine for Beatrice Harrington, whose plantation in Louisiana worked enslaved people 16 hours a day in the sugarcane fields, where the mortality rate was so high that they calculated profitability based on how quickly they could work people to death and replace them. He poured for Senator Pemberton, who had stood on the floor of the Virginia legislature and argued that slavery was a positive good, a civilizing force, God's will made manifest. He poured for Theodore Beaumont, who bred enslaved women like cattle and sold their children at auction when they were old enough to be useful elsewhere. Each glass was a small act of justice. Each refill brought them closer to the reckoning. The memory shifted, pulling Ezekiel deeper. 3 months ago, in the brutal heat of August, Delilah had fallen ill. It had started with a cough, then a fever that made her skin burn like fire, then chills that left her shaking beneath the thin blanket in their cabin. She'd asked Silas Crow for permission to rest, just one day to recover, and he'd laughed in her face. That laugh, wet and phlegmy and full of contempt, still echoed in Ezekiel's skull alongside Prudence's screams. Lazy, Crow had said, the word like a curse. You people are all lazy. Think you can shirk your work just because you got a little fever? Get back in that field or I'll give you something to really complain about. Delilah had tried. God, she had tried. She'd gone back to picking cotton under the merciless sun, her hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, her body swaying with weakness. But by midday she'd collapsed, simply crumpled between the rows like a puppet with cut strings. And Crow, standing there with his whip coiled at his belt, had decided to make an example of her. 20 lashes for laziness. For costing Master Thornley money with her weakness. For daring to be sick when there was work to be done. Ezekiel had been in the main house when it happened, polishing silver in the dining room where Abigail was entertaining her sister from Savannah. He'd heard Delilah's screams carry across the distance, heard them and felt something inside himself crack like old wood under pressure. The fork he'd been holding had slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, and Abigail's hand had struck his face before he'd even realized she'd moved. Clumsy fool, she'd hissed. Pick it up and get out of my sight. You're disturbing my guest. He'd picked up the fork with shaking hands, bowed, and backed out of the room while Delilah's screams continued and Abigail returned to her conversation about the weather and the latest fashions from Paris as though nothing at all was happening. As though the sound of a woman being whipped to death was no more remarkable than birdsong. They hadn't let him go to her until nightfall. By then, infection had already set into the wounds, the flesh around the lash marks hot and swollen and beginning to smell of rot. Delilah had been conscious enough to recognize him, to whisper Prudence's name, to ask where their daughter was, if she was safe, if she would come home. And Ezekiel had lied to his dying wife because the truth was too cruel even for a deathbed, had told her yes, Prudence would come home, they would all be together again soon, everything would be all right. She died 3 days later in his arms, her last words a garbled prayer for their daughter's safety. They'd buried her in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of the plantation, under a marker that bore no name because enslaved people's names didn't matter enough to be carved in stone. In the ballroom, Dorothea laughed at something Montgomery whispered in her ear, her face radiant with happiness. She wore pearl earrings that caught the candlelight, and Ezekiel knew exactly how much those pearls had cost because he'd heard Augustus negotiating the price. $400. Half of what they'd gotten for Prudence. The bride wore his daughter's value around her neck as jewelry. The fourth course arrived, whole roasted pheasants arranged on platters with their tail feathers still attached, surrounded by roasted root vegetables glistening with butter. The guests carved into them with silver knives, praising the tenderness of the meat, the skill of the cooks, never once considering the hands that had plucked and cleaned and roasted these birds while their own hands bore burns and scars. Ezekiel moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling glasses, watching the poison accumulate in their systems sip by sip. The lead was building in their blood, in their organs, in their nervous systems. It would be hours yet before the first symptoms appeared, the illness that would start slowly and build to a crescendo of agony. But it was already there, already working, already irreversible. Dr. Cornelius Wickham sat at a table near the center of the room, a portly man with matonchop whiskers and a fondness for pontificating about medical advances while practicing bloodletting for ailments that required actual treatment. He was discussing the four humors with Reginald Ashford, explaining how an imbalance of bile and phlegm could lead to moral degeneracy in the inferior races. The irony would be almost funny if it weren't so obscene, a doctor who couldn't recognize lead poisoning even as he drank it. Near the veranda, Silas Crow had found his way to a bottle of bourbon someone had brought from Kentucky, but he kept returning to the wine because Augustus had spared no expense and the quality was undeniable. His face was flushed, his collar loosened, and he told crude jokes to a group of overseers from neighboring plantations, men whose profession was cruelty, whose expertise was in breaking human spirits while maximizing productivity. They laughed and drank and compared notes on discipline techniques, on how many lashes it took to make an example, on which enslaved people were most likely to cause trouble and required closer watching. Ezekiel poured wine for all of them, his face blank, his movements precise. These men had whipped children, had separated families, had raped women and sold their own offspring, had built their lives on foundations of suffering so vast it defied comprehension. And tonight, they would pay. The calculation had been meticulous. Ezekiel had spent weeks planning, researching, remembering conversations he'd overheard about lead poisoning in the paint factories up north, about how it accumulated in the body, about how the old French wine sometimes caused mysterious illnesses because of the lead seals. He'd tested small amounts on rats in the cellar, watching how long it took, what the symptoms looked like, how much was needed to ensure death rather than mere sickness. He'd selected the oldest bottles, the ones where the lead had been leaching into the wine for decades. He'd calculated approximately how much each person would drink based on years of observation, Augustus's tendency to overindulge, Cornelius Jr.'s need to prove his capacity, the lady's more moderate consumption that would still be enough. He'd positioned the poisoned bottles strategically, ensuring maximum distribution while making it seem entirely random. And now, watching them drink and laugh and celebrate while the poison worked inside them, Ezekiel felt no guilt. No remorse. Only that cold, diamond-hard certainty that this was justice, imperfect, terrible, but the only justice available to a man who had been stripped of every other form of power. The musicians struck up a waltz, and couples began to dance. Dorothea and Montgomery led the first dance, spinning across the marble floor in perfect synchronization, their future spread before them like a golden road. Except there was no future. Not for them. Not anymore. Ezekiel stood in the shadows with an empty decanter in his hands and watched the doomed dance on. This story only gets darker from here. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've heard of other historical horror tales like this. The first symptom appeared during the 7th course, a roasted leg of lamb studded with rosemary and garlic, its juices pooling pink and glistening on the serving platter. Beatrice Harrington, seated between her husband Jeremiah and Senator Pemberton's wife, pressed a gloved hand to her abdomen and winced. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but Ezekiel saw it from his position near the wine service. He had been watching for it, waiting for it, the way a hunter waits for the first sign that his trap has sprung. "Are you quite all right, my dear?" Jeremiah asked, pausing with his fork halfway to his mouth. Yes, Beatrice replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a slight cramping. Too much rich food, I expect. Nothing to worry about." She reached for her water glass instead of her wine, and Ezekiel felt a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, not quite vindication. Just acknowledgement that the machinery he had set in motion was beginning to turn. Beatrice took a small sip of water and dabbed at her lips with her napkin, and the moment passed. The conversation around her continued without pause, a river flowing around a stone. But Ezekiel noticed. And he knew it had begun. 20 minutes later, Montgomery Ashford's younger brother Nathaniel excused himself from his table with a muttered apology about the heat. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, a grayish cast settling over his features like frost on glass. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed back his chair, and he moved toward the doors leading to the veranda with careful steps, as though walking on a ship's deck in rough seas. The young men he'd been drinking with laughed and made crude jokes about his capacity for wine, about how the Charleston boys couldn't hold their liquor like the Virginia gentlemen. They didn't see the slight sheen of sweat on Nathaniel's forehead, didn't notice how his jaw clenched against some internal discomfort. They simply called for more wine and returned to their conversation about bloodlines and breeding stock and the Charleston races. Ezekiel refilled their glasses with steady hands. The musicians continued playing, a lively contradance that had couples forming lines across the ballroom floor. The dancers moved through the figures with practiced grace, their faces flushed with exertion and wine, their laughter bright and careless. The chandeliers cast moving shadows as couples turned and stepped, and the whole scene seemed almost dreamlike, something out of a fairy tale where the ball would continue forever and nothing terrible could ever intrude upon such beauty, such wealth, such certainty of rightness. But beneath the surface, invisible and inexorable, the poison worked. Cornelius Jr. complained of a headache to Lavinia Sutherland, pressing his fingers to his temples with exaggerated discomfort. "It's this damned heat," he said, his words slightly slurred. "And Father's insistence on keeping every candle lit. As if we're trying to illuminate the whole of Virginia." Lavinia laughed indulgently and suggested he take some air, perhaps walk with her in the gardens where the night might be cooler. Cornelius agreed readily, though Ezekiel noticed the way he steadied himself on the table as he stood, the momentary disorientation that flickered across his features before he masked it with a rakish grin. They left through the French doors, Lavinia's hand tucked into the crook of Cornelius's arm, and Ezekiel watched them go with eyes that held no expression at all. The eighth course arrived, duck à l'orange, the skin crispy and glistening, the meat tender beneath. The guests attacked it with enthusiasm despite their earlier complaints of fullness, because there was always room for one more delicacy, one more taste of excess. Augustus Thornley held forth at the head table, his voice booming as he told a story about a horse race in Richmond, gesturing broadly with his wine glass and sloshing ruby liquid onto the white tablecloth. Abigail reached for her own glass and paused, her hand hovering in midair. A frown crossed her face, brief, confused, as though she'd forgotten what she'd been reaching for. She pressed her free hand to her stomach, her rings catching the candlelight, and for just a moment her carefully composed expression cracked to show something underneath. Discomfort. Uncertainty. The first edge of fear. Darling. Augustus broke off his story to glance at his wife. You look peaked. I'm fine, Abigail said sharply, her composure snapping back into place like a door slamming shut. It's merely warm here. Perhaps Ezekiel could open some windows. Yes, ma'am, Ezekiel murmured, setting down his decanter and moving to comply. As he passed behind her chair, he saw her hand remain pressed to her abdomen, the knuckles white with pressure. She didn't reach for her wine glass again. But Augustus did. He drained his glass and held it out for a refill without pausing in his resumed story, and Ezekiel poured the poisoned wine with the same careful precision he'd been using all evening. The crystal chimed softly as wine hit glass, a sound like small bells, like the wedding bells that had rung this afternoon to announce Dorothea's marriage and seal so many fates. Near the musicians, Dorothea herself swayed slightly as Montgomery led her back to their seats after a waltz. She was smiling, radiant in her wedding gown, but her face had taken on a waxy quality in the candlelight. She pressed delicate fingers to her forehead and laughed at something her new husband said, but the laugh sounded strained, pitched slightly too high. Are you feeling well, my love? Montgomery asked, ever solicitous, his hand supporting her elbow as they walked. Wonderfully well, Dorothea assured him, though she sank into her chair with what looked like relief. Just a bit dizzy from dancing. And perhaps the wine has gone to my head. Then we'll have water, Montgomery declared, signaling to a server. But when the water arrived, Dorothea took only the smallest sip, as though the act of swallowing had become difficult. A small line appeared between her brows, confusion, discomfort, then smoothed away as she forced another smile. The ballroom continued its celebration, the music and laughter and conversation flowing like water, but underneath the surface currents were shifting. A woman near the dessert table complained of nausea to her companion, then laughed it off as the perils of tight corseting. A man excused himself to vomit discreetly into a potted fern on the veranda, then returned to his table and blamed the oysters. Another guest developed a tremor in his hand that made his wine glass rattle against his teeth, and he blamed it on age and arthritis and reached for more wine to steady his nerves. They didn't understand what was happening to them. How could they? Lead poisoning was insidious, its symptoms easily mistaken for a dozen other ailments. Indigestion. Too much wine. The heat. Bad shellfish. Overindulgence. The natural complaints of a long evening of feasting. And because they didn't understand, they didn't stop drinking. They continued to refill their glasses, to toast the happy couple, to celebrate their wealth and power and God-given superiority. Dr. Wickham was summoned to attend to Beatrice Harrington, who had developed such severe cramping that she'd gone pale and had to retire to a sitting room off the main ballroom. The doctor examined her briefly, pronounced it a digestive upset from too much rich food, and prescribed rest and perhaps a dose of laudanum. He didn't recognize the metallic taste she complained of, didn't connect it to the wine that had been flowing freely all evening, didn't see the pattern forming like a spider's web across the assembled guests. How could he? Lead poisoning took time to manifest fully, and its early symptoms were so common, so easily explained away. By the time he recognized what was happening, if he ever did, it would be far too late. Ezekiel moved through the ballroom like a shadow, his presence so familiar it had become invisible. He cleared empty glasses and replaced them with full ones. He brought fresh decanters when the old ones emptied. He responded to every snap of fingers, every imperious gesture, every casual command with the same subservient efficiency that had kept him alive for 43 years. And all the while, he watched the poison spread through the crowd like an invisible plague, touching everyone who had raised a glass in toast. Silas Crow stood near the doorway to the veranda, swaying on his feet. His face had gone from flush to an unhealthy gray, and sweat darkened his collar despite the evening's relative coolness. He held his wine glass loosely, no longer drinking but simply holding it as though he'd forgotten what it was for. When one of the other overseers clapped him on the shoulder and asked if he was all right, Crow mumbled something about needing air and stumbled outside into the gardens. Ezekiel watched him go and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no remorse. Just that cold, clear certainty that justice, however terrible, however imperfect, was unfolding exactly as he had orchestrated it. The ninth course was being prepared in the kitchen, a selection of cheeses and fruits, a palate cleanser before the final desserts. But fewer guests were eating now. Complaints of fullness had given way to complaints of illness, subtle at first but growing more common. A headache here, stomach pain there, an odd metallic taste that wouldn't go away, a trembling in the hands that made utensils difficult to hold. Senator Pemberton excused himself from the table, his face set in lines of discomfort. His wife followed, her own face pinched with worry that she tried to hide behind social pleasantries. Theodore Beaumont loosened his cravat and called for more wine, thinking alcohol might settle his rebellious stomach, not realizing he was adding fuel to a fire already consuming him from the inside. At the head table, Augustus Thornley's booming voice had grown quieter. He still smiled, still played the gracious host, but his hand kept returning to his midsection, pressing against some internal distress he couldn't quite identify. Beside him, Abigail had gone very still, her face a porcelain mask that hid growing alarm. She caught Ezekiel's eye as he passed with a fresh decanter, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, something flickered between them. Recognition, perhaps. Or the first stirring of suspicion. But what could she suspect? That her house slave, her invisible servant, the man who had bowed and scraped for decades, could have orchestrated something like this? It was unthinkable. Impossible. Enslaved people didn't have the intelligence, the cunning, the capacity for such calculated revenge. That's what they told themselves, what they had to believe to justify the system they'd built their lives upon. Ezekiel met her gaze steadily, his face empty of all expression, and after a moment Abigail looked away. She reached for her water glass with a hand that trembled slightly, and in that trembling Ezekiel saw the first crack in the foundation of her certainty. The music played on. The candles burned. And in the glittering ballroom of Thornley Manor, the first tremors of the coming catastrophe rippled through the assembled guests like earthquake shocks before the ground splits open and swallows everything whole. The transformation from celebration to catastrophe happened gradually, then all at once, like a dam developing hairline fractures before it finally collapses and releases the flood. It was during the 10th course, elaborate towers of spun sugar and candied fruit meant to showcase the wealth and sophistication of the Thornley family, that the true horror began to manifest. Augustus Thornley stood to make another toast, his glass raised high, his mouth opening to speak words that would never come. Instead, his entire body went rigid, his back arching as though pulled by invisible strings, and the wine glass shattered on the marble floor. His eyes rolled back white in his skull, foam flecking his lips, and he collapsed backward into his chair with such force that it tipped and sent him crashing to the ground. The sound of his head striking marble echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, and for one eternal moment, everything stopped. Then Abigail began to scream. It was a sound Ezekiel had never heard from her before, raw, primal, stripped of all the refinement and superiority she wore like armor. She threw herself at her husband's convulsing form, her emerald silk dress pooling around her like spilled wine, her hands fluttering uselessly over his jerking limbs. Augustus! Augustus, what's happening? Someone help him. Dr. Wickham. For God's sake, someone do something. Dr. Wickham rushed forward, his own face pale and clammy with sweat, and knelt beside Augustus. But before he could even begin an examination, Cornelius Jr. staggered through the French doors from the garden, his face contorted in agony, one hand clutching his head as though trying to hold his skull together. Blood trickled from his nose in a thin red stream, and his eyes, those cruel eyes that had looked upon enslaved people with such contempt, were wild with terror and incomprehension. "Father," he gasped, reaching toward the head table. "Father, something's wrong, I can't. He never finished the sentence. His legs gave out and he fell, his body seizing on the ballroom floor, limbs thrashing against marble in a grotesque parody of the dancing that had filled this space just minutes before. Lavinia Sutherland, who had followed him inside, shrieked and backed away, her white muslin dress splattered with the blood from his nose, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. And then it spread like wildfire through dry grass. Beatrice Harrington, who had been resting in the sitting room, began convulsing so violently that she fell from the settee. Her husband tried to hold her, to stop the seizures, but his own hands were shaking uncontrollably, his face gray as ash, and he vomited blood across her pale pink gown. Senator Pemberton collapsed in the hallway, his wife falling beside him, both of them writhing and gasping as their nervous systems attacked themselves. At the center of the ballroom, Dorothea Thornley Ashford clutched her new husband's arm with desperate strength, her wedding veil askew, her face no longer radiant but twisted with pain and fear. "Montgomery," she whimpered, "Montgomery, what's happening to us? I feel so strange, I can't, my head, everything hurts." Montgomery tried to respond, tried to comfort his bride of mere hours, but his own voice came out garbled and thick. Blood began to seep from the corner of his mouth, and his eyes lost focus. He slumped forward onto the table, sending crystal glasses and fine china crashing to the floor, and Dorothea screamed, a sound of pure anguish that cut through the rising chaos like a blade. The ballroom had become a vision of hell dressed in wedding finery. Guests stumbled and fell, some dying quickly as their hearts gave out, others lingering in prolonged agony as the lead destroyed their organs and nervous systems. The beautiful marble floor was slick with vomit and blood and other fluids as bodies lost control of their most basic functions. The air filled with screams and prayers and incoherent babbling as minds fractured under the assault of the poison. Dr. Wickham moved from victim to victim in growing panic, his medical knowledge utterly inadequate for what he was witnessing. He checked pulses with trembling fingers, looked into eyes that had gone glassy and unfocused, tried to make sense of symptoms that seemed impossible. "I don't understand," he kept repeating, his voice rising toward hysteria. This can't be, what is this?" Theodore Beaumont died in his chair, his face frozen in an expression of shocked outrage, as though death itself had committed some unforgivable breach of etiquette. His wife survived him by perhaps 3 minutes, long enough to reach for his hand before her own heart seized. Reginald Ashford clutched his chest and toppled forward into the remains of the wedding cake, his last breath escaping in a wheeze of frosting and blood. Some guests tried to flee. They stumbled toward the exits on legs that no longer obeyed commands, fell on the stairs leading to the main entrance, collapsed in the gardens where the night air did nothing to ease their suffering. Montgomery's sister Felicity made it as far as the circular drive before her body betrayed her, and she died beside her carriage while her horses stamped nervously in their traces, sensing death but unable to understand it. Ezekiel stood near the wine service and watched it all with eyes that saw everything and showed nothing. His face remained that perfect mask of subservient emptiness even as the masters who had owned him died in droves around him. Other enslaved servants stood frozen at their posts, uncertain what to do, whether to help or flee or simply wait for orders that would never come. Some wept. Some prayed. Young Mercy fainted, overwhelmed by the carnage, and Obadiah caught her before she hit the ground. Only Temperance moved. She crossed the ballroom floor, stepping carefully around convulsing bodies and spreading pools of blood, until she stood beside Ezekiel. Her face was wet with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke, barely a whisper beneath the screams and prayers. "What have you done?" "Justice," Ezekiel replied, his voice flat and empty as a winter sky. "I've done justice." Temperance looked at the devastation, at Dorothea dying in her wedding dress, at Cornelius Jr. finally still on the floor, at Augustus Thornley's empty eyes staring at the chandelier that had cost more than a human life, and said nothing more. She simply stood beside him in the ruins of the celebration, bearing witness to the terrible mathematics of revenge. Silas Crow, the overseer, had made it only as far as the veranda. He lay curled on the flagstones, his body racked with spasms, his face purple and swollen. The hand that had wielded the whip against Delilah now clawed uselessly at the air, grasping for something, mercy, perhaps, or understanding, that would never come. When his eyes found Ezekiel through the doorway, there was a moment of clarity. Recognition. Understanding. Then the light went out of them, and Silas Crow died with Ezekiel's name unspoken on his lips. Abigail Thornley was among the last to die. The lead had worked more slowly in her system, perhaps she had drunk less, or perhaps God had decided she should suffer longer. She crawled across the ballroom floor, her emerald dress dragging behind her, her diamonds catching the candlelight. She reached Augustus's body and collapsed beside it, her hand finding his cold one. Blood trickled from her ears, from her nose, from the corners of her mouth. Her breath came in wet, rattling gasps. Her eyes found Ezekiel in his corner, and this time there was no question, no doubt, only certain knowledge of what had been done and who had done it. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible beneath the other dying screams. "It was you." Ezekiel met her gaze and let her see him, truly see him, for the first time in all the years he had served her. Let her see the rage and the grief and the cold satisfaction that lived behind the mask. Let her see the man whose daughter she had sold for silverware, whose wife she had allowed to be whipped to death, whose entire family she had destroyed with the casual cruelty of someone swatting flies. "Yes," he said simply. "It was me." Abigail tried to speak again, but blood filled her mouth and no words came. She convulsed once, twice, and went still, her hands still clutching her dead husband's, her diamonds glittering obscenely against the spreading crimson pool beneath her. The ballroom fell gradually silent as the last screams faded to whimpers and then to nothing at all. The musicians had died at their instruments. Obadiah had survived only because he had been enslaved and not permitted to drink the master's wine, but the white musicians lay slumped over their violins and cellos, one final discordant note hanging in the air before fading to silence. The candles in the chandeliers continued to burn, casting dancing light over a scene of absolute devastation. 73 people had entered this ballroom tonight in their finest clothes, full of laughter and certainty and the arrogance of power. Now they lay scattered across the marble floor like broken dolls, their finery soaked with blood and worse, their eyes staring at nothing. Dr. Wickham was among the dead, having succumbed to the same poison he had been unable to diagnose. Senator Pemberton lay beside his wife, their bodies intertwined in death as they had been in life. The Beaumonts from Savannah, the Harringtons from New Orleans, the Wainwrights from Baltimore, all dead. The Charleston Bells and their suitors, dead. Montgomery and Dorothea, married for mere hours, dead in each other's arms, their wedding night transformed into a shared grave. And through it all, the enslaved servants had survived. Those who had not been permitted to drink the master's wine, who had stood like furniture along the walls, who had been invisible in their bondage, they alone remained standing in the charnel house that Thornley Manor had become. Ezekiel walked to the center of the ballroom, his footsteps echoing in the terrible silence. He looked down at Augustus Thornley's body, at the man who had owned him for 36 years, and felt nothing. No triumph. No remorse. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where something, rage, perhaps, or hope, had been consuming him from the inside. The candles continued to burn. Outside, the night was beautiful, stars bright in a clear sky, crickets singing in the gardens. The world continued unchanged, indifferent to the massacre that had unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers and imported silk wallpaper. Ezekiel stood among the dead and waited for what would come next. What would you have done in this situation? Comment below, and don't forget to like this video if this story has left you unsettled. Dawn broke over Thornley Manor like a wound opening in the sky, red and raw and unforgiving. The first light crept through the ballroom windows and illuminated what the candlelight had softened, revealing every terrible detail in sharp relief. Blood had dried to brown stains on the marble floor. Bodies lay stiff and cold in positions of final agony. The wedding flowers, imported at such expense, had begun to wilt in their vases, their petals falling like tears onto the dead. Ezekiel had not moved from his position near the center of the ballroom. He had stood there through the long night hours while the candles burned down to stubs, while the last sounds of dying faded to silence, while the other enslaved servants fled or hid or simply sat in stunned horror at what had happened. He had stood like a statue, like a monument, like the only solid thing in a world that had come unmade. His white serving gloves were still spotless. His posture remained perfect. Only his eyes, if anyone had looked closely enough to see, held something wild and terrible and impossibly weary. Temperance found him there when she returned at first light. She had spent the night in the slave quarters, trying to calm the others, trying to make sense of the senseless. Now she stood in the doorway and looked at the devastation with eyes that had cried themselves dry. "They'll come for you," she said quietly. "You know they will." "I know," Ezekiel replied. His voice was hoarse from disuse, the first words he'd spoken in hours. "You could run. There's still time. Head north, try for." "No." The word was final, absolute. I'm not running. Let them come. And come they did, as the sun climbed higher and word spread through the county like pestilence. A stable boy from a neighboring plantation had been sent to Thornley Manor with a message and had found the carnage, had ridden back screaming about massacre and death and judgment from God. By mid-morning, Sheriff Tobias Marlowe arrived with 6 deputies, their faces grim with what they expected to find but unprepared for the reality that greeted them. The sheriff was a hard man, weathered by years of enforcing laws designed to protect property over people, but even he went pale at the sight of the ballroom. 73 corpses in their wedding finery, some still clutching wine glasses, others twisted in positions that spoke of unimaginable suffering. The bride died in her imported lace. The groom collapsed across her body. Children of prominent families, because some of the guests had brought their nearly grown sons and daughters, staring sightlessly at chandeliers that no longer glittered in daylight. "Sweet merciful Christ," one of the deputies whispered, and promptly vomited in a potted palm. Sheriff Marlowe's eyes swept the room and found the only living white face, Dr. Wickham, and realized with dawning horror that the doctor was as dead as the rest. His gaze moved to the enslaved servants clustered near the walls, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and fear and something else he couldn't quite identify. Then his eyes found Ezekiel standing alone in the center of the carnage, and something in the sheriff's expression hardened to flint. "You," he said, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "You did this." It wasn't a question. In the sheriff's mind, in the minds of all white men in Virginia in 1841, there was only one possible explanation for such devastation. The nightmare that lived in the back of every slave owner's consciousness had finally manifested, the enslaved had risen up and slaughtered their masters. That it had been done with poison rather than knives or clubs hardly mattered. The result was the same. "Yes," Ezekiel said simply. "I did." The confession sent a ripple through the deputies, hands reaching for weapons, but the sheriff held up a hand to stop them. He studied Ezekiel with the intensity of a man trying to understand something that violated every assumption he'd built his life upon. Enslaved people were supposed to be docile, simple, incapable of such elaborate planning and execution. They were property, livestock, not human enough for this kind of calculated revenge. How? The sheriff demanded. The wine. Lead poisoning. From the seals on old French bottles. Ezekiel's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts. It accumulated in their systems over the course of the evening. By the time the symptoms became severe, it was too late to save them. Why? This question came harder, as though the sheriff couldn't quite comprehend the asking of it. For the first time since dawn, something flickered in Ezekiel's eyes. "They sold my daughter to pay for silverware. They whipped my wife to death for being sick. They took my son, my mother, everyone I loved, and they called it property rights. They called it God's will." His voice remained steady, but the words themselves were weighted with 43 years of accumulated grief. "I gave them justice." "Justice?" The sheriff's face flushed with anger. "You call this justice? Murder? Massacre? This is insurrection, rebellion, the very thing The very thing you fear," Ezekiel interrupted, and for the first time in his life, he looked a white man directly in the eyes without lowering his gaze. "Because you know. Deep down, all of you know what you've done, what you continue to do. And you fear that someday will make you answer for it." The sheriff struck him then, a vicious backhand that split Ezekiel's lip and sent blood running down his chin. But Ezekiel didn't lower his eyes. Didn't bow. Didn't break. After 43 years of masks and silence and swallowed rage, he was finally, terribly free. They took him to Charleston in chains, though he didn't resist. Magistrate Josiah Cunningham convened a tribunal that was less a trial than a formality. The verdict was never in question: guilty of mass murder, guilty of insurrection, guilty of daring to strike back against a system that had declared him less than human. The sentence was equally predetermined: death by hanging, to be carried out publicly as a warning to any other enslaved people who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion. The story spread like wildfire through the South, whispered in slave quarters, discussed in panicked tones in plantation houses, debated in newspapers that struggled to make sense of it. Some called it an isolated incident of madness. Others saw it as evidence that stricter controls were needed, harsher punishments, more vigilant oversight. What they couldn't acknowledge, what they absolutely refused to see, was that it was the inevitable result of a system built on brutality and maintained through terror. That every whip stroke, every family separated, every child sold, every casual cruelty had been accumulating like poison in a bottle, waiting for the moment it would be served back to them. The Thornley Massacre, as it came to be called in the official records, was quietly suppressed as much as possible. The full details were deemed too inflammatory, too dangerous to widely publicize. Plantation owners increased their security, watched their slaves more carefully, tested their wine for contamination. But they didn't stop selling children. Didn't stop the whippings. Didn't question the fundamental assumptions that had led to 73 people dying in agony on what should have been a night of celebration. 3 weeks after the massacre, on a gray morning in Charleston, they led Ezekiel to the gallows in the town square. A crowd had gathered, white citizens eager to see justice done, enslaved people forced to attend as a lesson in the consequences of resistance. The hangman was a professional from Richmond, brought in specifically for this execution because of its significance. They read the charges, the verdict, the sentence. They asked if he had any last words. Ezekiel looked out at the crowd, at the enslaved faces in the back rows, at the white faces eager for his death, and for just a moment, he smiled. It was a small smile, terrible in its serenity. "Prudence," he said, speaking his daughter's name aloud for the first time since they'd taken her. "Delilah. Josiah. Esther. I'm coming home." The noose tightened. The trap door opened. And Ezekiel fell into darkness that was somehow lighter than all the years that had come before. In the weeks and months that followed, Thornley Manor stood empty. No one wanted to buy it, the massacre had tainted it, made it unsellable. The enslaved people who had survived were sold off to settle the estate's debts, scattered across the South to new masters, new plantations, carrying the story with them. Temperance was sold to a family in Georgia. Obadiah went to Mississippi. Young Mercy disappeared into the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade, her fate unknown. The manor itself began to decay. Windows broke and weren't replaced. Vines crept up the walls. The ballroom floor, never properly cleaned of the bloodstains, bore dark marks that wouldn't fade no matter how hard the new caretaker scrubbed. Locals began to avoid it, claiming they heard sounds at night, the clink of crystal glasses, the strain of violin music, screams that echoed from empty rooms. Some said it was haunted by the victims, by the 73 guests who had died in their finery, doomed to relive that terrible night forever. But others whispered a different story, that what haunted Thornley Manor wasn't the guests at all, but the invisible hands that had served them, the ghosts of enslaved people who had finally, terribly, found their power. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. The Confederacy fell. Slavery was abolished, though its echoes would reverberate for generations. Thornley Manor crumbled further, becoming a shell, a memory, a cautionary tale told in whispers. The ballroom where 73 people had died remained largely intact, protected from the elements by some quirk of architecture, its chandeliers still hanging though tarnished black, its marble floor still bearing those dark stains that wouldn't fade. And on certain nights, particularly in late October, when the anniversary of the Thornley wedding approached, people claimed you could still see a figure standing in the center of that ruined ballroom. A man in serving clothes, holding a crystal decanter, pouring invisible wine for guests who would never stop dying. Some said he was cursed to repeat his crime for eternity. Others said he was there by choice, bearing witness to the terrible mathematics of justice, to what happens when the powerless finally seize the only power available to them. The historical record of the Thornley Massacre was deliberately obscured, buried in archives, excluded from official histories. It was too dangerous a story to tell, too threatening to the narratives that the South constructed about itself, of benevolent masters and contented slaves, of natural hierarchy and divine order. But the story survived anyway, passed down through families, whispered in slave quarters and later in freedom, a reminder that resistance took many forms and that every system of oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Ezekiel's name was eventually lost to time, as were the names of so many enslaved people whose stories were never recorded, whose resistance was never acknowledged, whose humanity was denied by the very documents that tracked their sale and ownership. But the act itself, the terrible, perfect revenge of the house slave who served his master's poisoned wine, lived on as myth, as warning, as testament to the human capacity for both endurance and retribution. In the end, Thornley Manor collapsed entirely, the ballroom floor finally giving way, the chandeliers crashing down in a cascade of tarnished crystal. The land was eventually sold and developed, houses built over the ruins, families moving in without knowledge of what had happened there. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings, residents report strange things. The taste of metal in their mouths. The clink of glasses when no one is there. The sensation of being watched by eyes that see everything and judge accordingly. And in the historical record, buried deep in Charleston courthouse archives, there remains a single line in a ledger from November 1841, Ezekiel, property of the Thornley estate, executed for murder. No surname recorded. No age recorded. No further notation required. No further notation. As though a man's entire existence, his grief and rage and terrible justice, could be reduced to a single line in a ledger. As though the act that destroyed 73 lives and exposed the rotting core of an entire system could be dismissed with bureaucratic brevity. But stories, unlike bodies, don't stay buried. They rise like smoke, like whispers, like the taste of lead and wine served by hands that were never supposed to have power but found it anyway in the only place left to them, in the invisible spaces, the trusted positions, the moments when masters let down their guard because they had convinced themselves that the people they enslaved were incapable of complex thought, of planning, of the kind of calculated revenge that required intelligence and patience and an understanding of chemistry that wasn't supposed to exist in property. The Thornley wedding massacre of 1841 remains a footnote in history, deliberately obscured, systematically suppressed. But it endures as a dark reminder of a truth that every empire built on oppression eventually learns, that there are no truly powerless people, only people whose power has been compressed and denied until it finds release in ways that no one anticipated, in forms that no one can control. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, perhaps Ezekiel walks free, his hands no longer trembling, his daughter's name no longer a scream in his skull but a benediction, his wife's memory honored not by submission but by the terrible, perfect justice he served in crystal decanters to masters who never saw him coming until it was far, far too late. Thank you for watching this macabre tale. If you enjoyed this dark journey into history's horrors, subscribe for more stories that will haunt your dreams. What historical event should I cover next? Tell me in the comments below.